Does gatekeeping meet the definition of abuse? Now, this is a big question. It's one that I've kind of had for many years, and we recently did an event called The Ethics of Gatekeeping, where we asked basically a number of legal bods about different questions around this kind of issue. Now, this is January 2024 and I'm recording this. I am completely fixed on the post office scandal. I'm watching lots of the full kind of evidence hearings and stuff. I find it fascinating. I'm very interested to know if people, if anyone else sees parallels between the post office scandal and what I would describe as a scandal of gatekeeping. And just for those who kind of don't know the jargon, gatekeeping is when a housing officer deliberately, knowingly prevents a vulnerable person from being housed, from enjoying the assistance that's owed to them under housing law. So gatekeeping is not a legal term, but it's a term that's used widely. The local government ombudsman use it. And I would say as well, like we're not only talking about that kind of initial prevention of those duties, but also where a housing officer knowingly issues a, like say for example, a not vulnerable decision to somebody who's obviously vulnerable, they know full well is vulnerable, just as part of that game playing kind of setup you get with these decisions. Now, anyone who works in the sector will have done basic safeguarding awareness training, or they certainly should have. And in that training, it goes through different types of abuse. So the point is that, as a professional, you can't identify abuse if you don't understand what the definition is. So it talks about the obvious types of abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, those kind of things. But it also has this category of institutional abuse and also psychological abuse. And within the guidance and within the kind of case law and the textbooks I've read, every example of institutional abuse was in a care setting, and if you're a lawyer, you'll know that there's no duty of care within the Housing Act as such. But what that basically means is if a housing officer is not doing their duty around housing law, then and you say, they're not discharging their duty of care, then actually that's legally nonsense. It just doesn't kick in for reasons I don't understand, but it just doesn't. So for a long time I've had this question, is gatekeeping a criminal offence? And I was certainly thinking in terms of misfeasance in a public office, where again, you've got a public officer, so a housing officer would definitely be a public officer, is knowingly or recklessly, denying a duty or something to someone they can reasonably see is going to suffer harm, which again, would very much be kind of come into play with telling a homeless person, there's nothing we can do, go back to the streets sort of thing. So is it a criminal offence? And that's a question I also asked in the ethics event. And I got what I would say was a kind of an inconclusive answer, because both lawyers I asked were not criminal lawyers. They both worked within housing and kind of sort of civil law, I guess. So for me, that question's still open. I'll be very interested to hear from anyone in the comments about any cases they're aware of where it's been shown to be a criminal offence, because I think it might be. Certainly with the post office scandal, there has been talk of this offence, misfeasance in a public office, being used against these different kind of people in the post office, where they have knowingly prosecuted people, where they've knowingly kind of withheld evidence or whatever, so that the person got prosecuted and went to jail. So I'm very interested to see how that works out. But in this case of abuse, I've asked lots of people over the years, and I got to ask Professor Luke Clements, and I'm going to put the video clip in a minute just so you can see it for yourself. But Professor Luke Clements, he writes the industry standard textbook on the adult social care, so the Care Act 2014. And so if anyone's an expert in this, he's going to be that expert. And I put the question to him, and he basically said, yes. I think I put him on the spot, so I'm not going to hold him to it legally. But certainly what he said was, the definition of abuse is very broad. And when a housing officer is knowingly discharging a duty unlawfully, then it may well kick in. And I think he probably says it even a bit stronger than that, saying actually, it probably is abuse. Now, I've only actually raised a safeguarding alert against a housing officer once, and it was back in 2019 in Bedford, when we had a really bad run of housing officers, to say the least. The most outrageous cases I ever saw were in that period. And so we had a situation where they were literally just refusing to take an application off someone and consider his vulnerability. So I raised a safeguarding alert. I never got a definitive answer from the safeguarding team either. However, it did have the desired effect in terms of they did actually accept the application, and it kind of did lead to some good. But it kind of does put this kind of question to us, and I think with Luke's answer in this clip, it puts this answer, or this kind of problem to us almost, where if we are in the course of our casework working with someone who we see being gatekept, I think potentially, certainly in my practice, I will be raising safeguarding alerts against a local authority housing officer, and I will be ticking the institutional abuse in that referral form. I might also tick the psychological abuse in terms of just the trauma that comes from that kind of impact of being told that, you know, there's no help, or, you know, kind of put into the streets, and that harm that does. And you know, and I think that's going to be my approach. I appreciate that it's pretty hardcore, but I think that's what we are required to do as professionals. Now, you know, this isn't legal advice, as I've said plenty of times on the channel, but certainly me as a professional, the next case I come across where a council officer is deliberately, or you know, or seems to be deliberately, you know, kind of preventing someone from being housed or having a safe roof put over their head, then I'm going to be raising it as a safeguarding alert, and I'm going to see what happens. I may well return to this topic in another video, but anyway, I'm going to insert this clip into it so you can see for yourself, just to get a bit of context. And if you want to watch the whole event, then I would, you know, I found it properly fascinating. It's certainly, as I say, I think more and more that there's kind of this consciousness that's coming out of the post office scandal, where, you know, we have a situation with gatekeeping where it's across the country. You know, if you look at the LGO upheld complaints, they come across, you know, all over the country, mostly in London and Birmingham, to be honest, but that's because that's where the most of the legal centres are that actually do this kind of work. But it's something which is very common. You know, it's got a word, it's got a term, gatekeeping, in terms of us describing it, and it's something which I think a lot of people, if not everyone in the homelessness sector, knows about, to the point where I've heard of kind of meetings happening in the, you know, kind of higher echelons of the homelessness sector, where they very clearly know that gatekeeping is wrong, and they very clearly avoid tackling the issue. So I think, you know, as with the post office scandal, we've got something that goes right from kind of front level housing officers right up to the very top, you know, very top of the sector. And it's something which I hope one day is going to see some justice. You know, we talk about the post office scandal as this, you know, big miscarriage of justice. I believe the same terminology applies to gatekeeping. We are looking at hundreds of thousands of people in England being systematically denied their rights under the Housing Act as citizens. So it's a civil rights issue, and they very clearly come to harm because of it, not just directly through being left on the street or whatever, but actually the harm that does to them in terms of kind of what they think of society and what they think their place in society is. I think that's a real cost that you can't give a number to, but I think that has a massive impact. You know, you've got kids growing up in temporary accommodation that's inappropriate. You've got kids who are left in domestic abuse situations. That is a generational issue that's going to cause a lot of problems. And as I say, I hope one day there is some kind of, you know, kind of trigger that means that people suddenly start taking it seriously, and, you know, and ultimately build enough houses for everyone. So yeah, I think that's something which is, yeah, I'm finding fascinating with the post office scandal at the moment. As I say, I'm hoping that kind of this accountability that's been seen by, you know, Paula Venables and kind of these senior lawyers and stuff, I think it'll be very interesting to see how that rides out. You know, there's talk of them going to prison, there's talks of criminal offences, and going back quite some way. So, you know, I've watched there's a video called The Art of Law, really cool channel, by a barrister. I think I don't know too much about him, but he kind of does lots of kind of, you know, latest sort of headline stuff and picks them apart from a legal point of view. He did a video about bringing private prosecutions, and I'll be very interested to see if this stuff is, if gatekeeping is a criminal offence, can members of the public bring private prosecutions? And his video on it would suggest that it's very plausible, and, you know, in theory, I guess could go back many years. You know, and you might be thinking, well, what have I got against housing officers? Well, some housing officers are great. Some housing officers are the worst. You know, when I was watching the post office inquiry with the investigator, his name's Stephen something, I can't remember his name, and just looking at how he was in that inquiry, kind of giving evidence, I just thought, you know what, I met quite a few housing officers who were a bit similar to him, to be honest, and yeah, and they do a huge amount of harm, and they know they're doing it. You know, when I worked in Bedford Borough Council and whistle blew, the team knew that it was happening, and some housing officers would boast about it. There's no two ways about it, and sometimes they would deny housing to people on the basis of their race or, you know, kind of other protected characteristic. Other times because they just didn't like them. You know, it might be they committed a criminal offence or something, and they just took it upon themselves to, you know, to gatekeep them or whatever. So it's yeah, it's pretty dark, I'd say. And as I say, I would say most people in the sector know about it. Certainly most homeless people know about it. And as we've said elsewhere, as we say in the ethics event, you know, Luke Clements talks about this term, systems generated trauma. What we see is lots of people who are gatekept. That becomes like one of the worst things about being homeless, if not the worst thing about being homeless, is how they are denied, you know, kind of a fair hearing. They are, by default, they're disbelieved, and they're basically just, kind of dismissed and kind of, treated pretty horribly, even in a systemic way, so they're expected to give really important information, really sensitive information in an open plan customer service centre. That's not lawful from a data protection point of view, but that whole experience is just horrendous, and I've seen a lot of very tough people get really kind of badly affected by it, and as I say, that's kind of why I've got this bee in my bonnet about housing officers. I have no problem believing that there are plenty of good housing officers around. I have a problem with believing that the good housing officers don't know about the bad housing officers. That's kind of where I get a little bit like, I don't know, just kind of a little bit suspicious of it, really, because gatekeeping is rife, even at a systemic level. I'm sorry to keep going on about this. Even within the IT systems that councils use, it's often embedded into it, where, for example, you've got domestic abuse survivors approaching the council's online system. They are homeless, and yet they are treated under Part 6 of the Housing Act rather than Part 7, because the IT system itself doesn't reroute them down the Part 7 route immediately, so they can actually get housing assistance immediately, and they get left in these situations for many years, and it's completely avoidable. As I say, I think everyone in the sector knows about it. A really frustrating case recently. We got a really good outcome. The individual was housed with her kids, but the IDVA service that I spoke to initially, so the domestic abuse service I spoke to initially, when I said to them about this council, why haven't you challenged this council? And they kind of just shrugged and said, well, that's just how the council is. And what we've been able to do with kind of raising the complaint is to get the family housed, get compensation for them, and also get the council to make significant improvements in their practices. So, I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, but it's that kind of that sort of shrugging from the voluntary sector I just found really frustrating. And again, I find it to be fairly common. So as I say, I'm just trying to explain why this bothers me so much. There's probably more to say about it, but anyway, I'll play the clip. You can watch it for yourself. As I say, this isn't legal advice, but I think as a professional, you are within your rights to raise a safeguarding alert when gatekeeping is happening. It basically seems to meet the definition of abuse, and therefore, as professionals, we are trained to have a zero tolerance approach to it and make referrals immediately. So I take no responsibility for the outcome of it. You will probably get some shit from your hierarchies or whatever. That's the system, unfortunately. That's just the way it is. If people don't put their heads above the parapet, then the sector continues. But just to warn you, putting your head above the parapet is a horrendous experience and is not likely to do your career any good. So do kind of think through this carefully. Don't be reckless and go and do something stupid that you then regret. But as I say, all I can say is, for me, I will be taking this action in cases that I'm involved in future. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, here's the clip. My next question is kind of related, just whilst we're on this topic. And this is probably to you, Luke, because I've asked lots of people this question before and no one had a clear answer for me. But if anyone knows, I think you will. Again, if you've got a housing officer who knowingly denies housing to someone unlawfully, and let's say for the sake of argument, that person clearly has care and support needs, would it ever be the case that would become a safeguarding issue in terms of, would it be institutional abuse? I think the answer is no, but I just want to hear it from an expert. And if it's not institutional abuse, would it be any other form of abuse that kind of might kind of mean that we would potentially raise a safeguarding alert, for example, if we were working with someone who'd just been gatekept? So hopefully that question makes sense. It was a bit of a rambling one, but
I think it would be abuse. Institutional abuse. The ombudsman's used that phrase not recently against local authorities for failing to provide support, and that could, of course, be housing. I think the definition within, if you're looking at the Care Act, of abuse is very wide now. So you could argue that. It'd be an interesting point. I've never heard it done, but